Again, I'm real sorry about all this. Finn Krieger excused himself for the nth time, his face tired with dark lines running across it, as he looked down towards the small screen of his phone. I really wasn't planning to be gone this long. I thought I stopped by long enough to see the election and maybe celebrate, but... Nonsense, Finn. The stocky woman on the other side of the line replied in a slightly scolding tone, drawing each syllable out to give it proper emphasis. Her wide face that was rarely seen with anything but a wide smile had briefly morphed into a look of what could only be described as strict empathy, while the large sun hat she wore over her brunette, braided hair threw an almost menacing shadow over her features, due to the angle in which she looked down at her own phone. Your boy needs you. You think Nico and I could stop dragging you away from him now? We've known James since he was barely tall enough to spit at my knee. The least we can do is watch the place for a little longer, or you'll make sure he gets back on his feet all right. Finn closed his eyes briefly and exhaled slowly through his nose. Claudia Coing sure had a way with words. Well, considering her daughter, the apple didn't fall all that far, he supposed. Yeah, he finally exhaled, and briefly rubbed 2 fingers over his eyes, before he slowly turned to look at the large bed next to him. Despite the many machines he had to be connected to make sure his lungs wouldn't spontaneously decide to collapse after the trauma they suffered, James looked rather peaceful as he lay there, his eyes closed and his breathing, although machine-supported, slow and even. This was probably the most rest the boy had gotten in a long time. It doesn't feel like there's really a lot I can do here, he said aloud, without really meaning to. The words just sort of fell out of his mouth as he took in his nephew. He had watched the news. He had seen the horrible footage of the attack on James that had somehow surfaced. Well, he had seen parts of it. In the end, he hadn't managed to bring himself to watch the whole thing. He always averted his eyes. In the past, when it had just been the 3 of them for a while, there had been more than a few times when he had to step up and defend his kiddos. Of course, technically, Sophia had always been there in the background, ready to take action in case things ever became too dicey. However, she was usually also pretty far away, and thus only able to intervene in really big things. And besides, Finn was no slouch either. He was more than able to make sure a couple of twerps kept their heads when they got a little too big for their britches. But that was then, and this was now. He had seen that footage, and even if he was no slouch... Finn Krieger! Claudia's voice suddenly ripped him out of his thoughts. Although he could see little more than her face on his screen, he was sure her free hand was planted firmly on her hip, as she sternly glared at him, with her tone dipping into the fullest mum territory, which had likely managed to scare many a silly thought out of her accomplished daughter's mind. You, sir, need to keep your ego in check. Finn's own expression turned to confusion as her words sank in for him. His ego. While he was most definitely one to brag if the occasion allowed for it, and fully aware of that, he didn't really hear how his words could have gotten any false confidence across. He certainly felt far from it. Still, you're going somewhere with that, aren't you? He guessed. He had lived next to Claudia Coing for long enough to know that she wasn't one to chastise people without a good reason for it. Claudia's lips lifted into the far more familiar expression of a smile, seeming rather pleased that he asked. Almost as if to underline him acting exactly like she had anticipated, the distant roar of a lion briefly interrupted the call. Finn would recognize that roar anywhere. It seemed like Parker was very sternly letting one of his temporary caretakers know that them walking across the fence of his enclosure was not appreciated. Claudia briefly looked away from the screen, likely in the direction of said enclosure, and quietly chuckled to herself for just a second, before returning her gaze to Finn. "Ain't I always?" she replied to his mostly rhetorical question, and tapped her finger against her plump cheek as it got pushed up by her smile. Then she let her hand sink down again, and her smile fell somewhat, though most likely that was mostly because she wanted to make sure he really took her seriously as she spoke. "Finn, do you know what's the problem with thinking you can't do a lot right now?" she asked him directly, and her expression remained kind as she waited for him to answer. Finn sighed and rubbed a hand along the greying hair on the back of his head. He figured she was trying to cheer him up, so he actually took a moment to think about some sort of encouraging message she would probably try to bestow on him. "Because, long as I still contribute what I can, that's all I should ask of myself," he finally offered, that being the best he could come up with. And it was the kind of thing he used to bestow on his kids back in the day. Doing what you could was all that anyone could expect of you, and that should probably include yourself. However, Claudia cracked up ever so slightly. "Nah," she very simply rebuffed him, chuckling to herself. Though after a moment her words turned a little more diplomatic as she added, "I mean, you're close, in the way, but still, nah." Finn lifted an eyebrow, not sure if he should feel confused or insulted. Not that he would feel insulted, but he did wonder if he should. Still, instead of uselessly asking or snapping at her, he just waited for her to explain herself. And Claudia seemed to be aware of that, judging by her smile. "Though, I suppose it fits. That's sort of the Type A version of what I'm trying to tell you," she briefly commented further, before finally quelling her laughter and buying herself some time by clearing her throat so her voice would be steady when she finally got to the point. "No, Finn. The problem with thinking I can't do a whole lot here, in your situation, is that it means you assume whether you can do a lot or not matters." Finn did snap up a little that time. Not because what she said offended him, but because that sounded oddly familiar. "You see," Claudia went on undeterred, now in full life lesson mode, "don't you think it means a lot for James that you're there for him, no matter what you're actively doing? I mean, don't get me wrong, there are certainly times and places when you are expected to and most certainly should step up, and people will let you know when that time comes. So if James comes to you in tears, begging you to please help him, you'll have my permission to despair in your own helplessness. Until then, I should just be there and listen." Finn finished the sentence for her with a sigh. He had always wondered just where exactly his sister had gotten that specific piece of wisdom from. Turns out, the culprit had apparently been living right next door this entire time. Claudia rolled her eyes and shook her head slightly. "It's not always about providing a solution," she said. Her tone was less lecturing now. It was more gentle, tender, and most certainly spoke from experience. "Sometimes helping people to help themselves just means sitting there and letting them pour all their frustration out before just saying, 'Yeah, that sucks,' and nodding politely. Personally, I think James neither expects nor wants you to try and come to his rescue. I do, however, think it would mean a lot to him if he wakes up and you are there, waiting for him." Finn nodded slowly and looked over at his nephew once again. "Yeah," he concurred with her assessment. In all honesty, James would probably get pissed if he tried to stick his nose too deeply into this whole matter. For a moment he flashed back to that first rainy day, when James had just returned to Earth after all the torture he had gone through, and to the shitty excuse for a welcome he himself had been able to provide for the kid. How they had sat out in the rain and smoked together, as if it wasn't something that both of them knew they hated. He had felt so damn powerless that he had reached for that damn stuff again, and James was so worried about him that he was fine with any method to try and reach him. Although he probably didn't know it, James needed to remind him that he was an adult that day. And not just any adult, but a capable one at that. Flawed, like they all were, sure, but capable. Then, Finn thought again about how he couldn't even watch that damn footage. However, although he had looked away, he did hear one last sentence that was there in some version of the footage, but not in others, which haunted him. "I called heads." It was a gamble. It was all a gamble. Heads or tails, do or die. Just an inch between James and a stake through the heart. He sighed, and at least for the moment, he banished the thought from his mind. "You know," he said, quickly trying to divert the topic so he would have something else to focus on, "the last time I got advice like that, it was about girls." Claudia laughed loudly, large creases forming along her cheeks. Finn knew he was fully aware that he was changing the topic. However, she had apparently decided to let him get away with it. Well, to be fair, that boy is better in heels than I ever was, she replied, going along with Finn's diversion. I think that's enough to earn him the honorary "gets too uselessly vent to blow off steam" card. Finn laughed along with her and nodded. After a moment of peaceful laughter, a thought seemed to pop into Claudia's head. Speaking of which, she piped up, her tone instantly changing back to a more conversational one, almost as if she had ran into him in the line at the grocery store. Could you please tell Koko she forgot her lovely green pair at our house before she left? We found it under the bed and we don't want her to go searching for it. Finn had to suppress a noise in his throat, of which he didn't even quite know what it would have become if it managed to slip out. Once he was sure his voice was good to go, he somewhat hesitantly replied, I doubt she's going to need them anytime soon. A loud beeping pierced through the previously quiet room, ripping Shida from a surprisingly deep sleep that she hadn't expected to find any time soon. Groggily, she lifted her head and started to blink the blurriness out of her eyes. Her ears perked up as they searched for the source of the incessant noise, and she took her first deep inhale after gaining semi-awareness. For some reason, her bed smelled strange. Close to her, she felt another body shifting, likely awoken by the same noise that had ripped her from her sleep. In her cloudy state, the feline grumbled deeply, folding her ears back to try and somewhat suppress the sound. James, can you turn that off? She complained with her croaky morning voice, before then lifting an arm to properly rub her eyes, to try to see clearly again. However, the voice that responded, in a certainly amused, but also very hesitant and a little bit awkward chuckle, wasn't the deep, smooth tone of her boyfriend. However, it was familiar. Sorry. Koko excused herself, and quickly shut the alarm off while Shida shot up from her lying position, her ears fully erect now as her brain needed a few seconds to completely recall the situation she had fallen asleep in. That's right, James wasn't here. Instead, Koko had agreed to keep her some company again. Sleeping in the same bed hadn't been part of that plan originally, however, it had just sort of turned out that way. Though while they had comforted each other while they were awake, they had spent the night laying more than an arm's length apart in the large bed, leaving a good bit of empty space between them. Not that it would have been any more sinister had they laid any closer, but under the circumstances, this had felt more respectful. Somehow. Duty calls. Koko meanwhile stated after glancing at her phone. Had to set it a bit earlier so I could get to my own cabin and get ready in time. Being far more of a morning person than both James and Shida, the commander quickly jumped to her feet and began to stretch. She had slept in most of her uniform, minus the jacket and boots, and was therefore basically ready to head out. Though before she left, she glanced back at the feline for a moment. You'll be fine? She asked candidly, obviously still a bit concerned about Shida. Shida, just a little embarrassed about her half-awake grumbling earlier, nodded. Yeah, I'm good. Thank you again for your time. I know I've not made things easy on you, she replied, and pushed herself up into a sitting position so that the blanket slid off her in large parts. Koko looked back at her both with empathy, but also with a hint of austerity. I really hope this is not you trying to get me to let you off easy, she replied. She kept her tone to a believably teasing one, but Shida could tell that there was just a trace of honest warning coming along with it. She was, however, completely undeterred by that and simply shook her head. I'm not going to ask to be let off the ship, not even if James wakes up, she replied, in a promise to both Koko and herself. I understand it's better if I stay here for the time being, and I meant it. I'm sorry. Koko's smile got stronger and turned more clearly genuine as she gently nodded. She turned towards the door, and Shida couldn't help but smile as well when she noticed that a bit of her usual bounce had returned to her step after being absent for a while. And remember, Koko gave as her last bit of advice before disappearing through the door, you have your mandatory appointments with Dr. Naustjen. If you want the faintest chances of keeping your rank after all this, you're not going to miss those. I won't, Shida assured her. She waved Koko off and then waited for the door to close completely. Once it sealed, she gave the command to lock it, before she fought herself out of her blanket and got to her feet, quickly shedding her sleepwear as she headed into the bathroom. After her shower, she felt refreshed. She felt clean. With the warm air of her hairdryer, she freed up a bit of a window in the hazy mirror, just large enough to look at herself. She inspected her face, briefly running her finger over the dark bags under her eyes that persisted despite the single night of proper sleep, before then sliding it down along the scars that decorated the right side of her face. "Scratches? You gotta pull yourself together," she firmly advised herself, deliberately using her slightly derogatory call sign. In her mind, she replayed some parts of the conversation she had with Naozam, some of the advice her old mentor had given her. However, she did her best not to dwell on it. Advice was good, and she couldn't deny that she was incredibly thankful that at least one part of her past wasn't horrible to remember. But she wanted to avoid falling into the pattern of fixating on that high, instead of her previous low now, because she felt like if she did, it would be all too easy to fall right back down as soon as the reinforcement wasn't the freshest thing in her mind anymore. A sentiment that Dr. Naustian supported a little later, when Shida met her on the call just as she had promised. And although Shida couldn't claim she felt that they made any groundbreaking progress that day, she did notice that she had a much easier time with being completely honest with her therapist during today's session, even if some of the topics were very fresh and understandably painful. Once the session came to its end and they said their goodbyes, Shida checked her phone to see when her window to visit James was coming up. Seeing that it was still an hour out, she decided to pass the remainder of that time by something she had sort of allowed to fall by the wayside a little too much recently. She got caught up on the news. And with all the council members making their own moves now that the election was over, there were plenty of news to catch up on. A lot about what James's allies had been up to, and the people who tried to sabotage them as they did. Since her mind was sort of hung up on the topic of old mentors, despite her best efforts, Shida couldn't help her scowl as she saw that Rook Tusma had stepped up to the plate. Still, although it was certainly annoying that the bastard could only talk such a big game today because she had reacted so quickly back then, she consoled herself with the fact that Ajaxia seemingly had no qualms about shooting back against the guy. Though, her insistence on being the bigger person after he so clearly crossed more than just one line with his comments did irk the feline. They had been the bigger people for so long. She quickly switched to a different topic before she could get caught up in that line of thinking. Apparently, a sort of round-table discussion on the inner workings of the council between Nicola and Tharavel had gained a good bit of traction on the net. Granted, not just positive traction. Apparently, a disconcertingly large number of people were convinced that the Parisian councilwoman was lying about what happened behind closed doors, and was simply making it all up for attention. Even if, as far as Shida could see, not a single actual council member disputed her story about the inconsequential nature of the first session publicly. In fact, the biggest comment it had garnered at all was of Councilwoman Magisteria, who had stated towards one unnamed reporter that the first days of a brand new council were expected to be somewhat slower due to the unfamiliar nature of such a big shift in the government's makeup. That, however, didn't seem to stop the conviction of those commenters. Oh well, at least it seemed like Quiz had a successful outing on TV. And wow, Shida was impressed. Apparently Zishadi, just on his first day, had somehow managed to already secure some of the desperately needed trade routes that Dunama had been denied through the council's dark underbelly for such a long time. Say what you want about him, but that man really had a sense for business, she thought. Or, well, maybe a for many wares almost completely untapped market, populated by a very spending-happy species, was simply too good an opportunity to pass up for the traders he had made the offer to. That was certainly a possibility as well. Either way, it seemed like the skirmish for Dunama's #1 spot between the Zishadi and the Quafrem Ther Komotopeno was all but concluded at this point. Shida highly doubted that the White Lion, as James sometimes called him, would be able to keep his dominance over the meat market for much longer, especially since it had already been shaken through the humans' intervention. For a while, it had been unclear who was the Deathworld's true leader, but soon there would be no doubt remaining. And although she had very little connection to her world of origin left at this point, Shida still couldn't deny a certain sense of ease at the thought that the hardest times were hopefully behind her people now. Hopefully, with one of them on the council, the Miat would be able to reconnect with the galaxy, just like they were always meant to. Though, that left her to wonder just what Carthrone would try to possibly avert that obvious outcome, now that he was officially on the ropes. That would remain to be seen. Just before the hour was over, a notification popped up on Shida's screen. Although she was suspended from duty, there was a certain level of information that everyone on all 4 of the ships that were involved in this current mission was privy to. Periodic reminder. All communication concerning locations, orders, plans of duty, rotations, or anything else resembling vital and/or classified information is to be confirmed for validity through Asset Alpha India Free of Azilon. Do not trust any remote communication that has not been confirmed through the asset. Do not give any vital or classified information to parties that have not been verified through the asset. Report any suspicious occurrences or behaviors in regards to communication or the function of any networks and systems of ship, station, or equipment to the asset. Be aware, be vigilant, be taciturn. Shida bit her lip with one of her fangs as she read over it. After all, she had been one of the first victims who had made this sort of reminder necessary in the first place. Whatever kind of imitation program their unseen opposition had set upon them, it was a rather unsettling presence in all this. Technically, since she hadn't called Azilon to confirm, Shida couldn't even be sure that her earlier meeting with her therapist had been 100% legit. Though she sincerely hoped that her regular therapy wasn't interesting enough for that program to try and insert itself into, especially if the doctor didn't suddenly start giving her obviously bad advice to disobey her orders or anything. Well, the worst part about that would have probably been that if she was talking to a fake Dr. Naustian, the real one would likely mark her as absent during the call. Shida pressed her finger down on Azilon's contact. As usual, the call was almost immediately picked up. "Hey, Azilon?" Shida greeted, already getting up to start her walk to James's hospital room. "Sorry to bother you with something like this, but if you have the capacity, could you maybe check if my connection with Earth earlier was legit?" Once she was done talking, Shida waited for an answer for a couple of seconds. However, the line remained almost eerily quiet, even if a connection was clearly there. When Shida was just about to ask if anyone was there, the realized's voice finally came through the line. "Oh, yeah, that was fine," Azilon replied, more unsure and stuttering than she usually talked. She sounded stressed, at least as far as that was possible with a digital being like her. Shida's face scrunched up in worry. "Is everything alright with you?" she asked carefully. If it really was just stress, she didn't want to stress the AI out even more by being a bit too probing, especially since Azilon was socialized as a Miat for the most part. Still, something was clearly up. Once again, there was a disconcerting pause before the realized replied, Yes, everything is fine. I mean, everything's okay. I'm okay," she assured hastily, almost as if she was trying to make up for the time she had taken to reply in the first place. Even Shida noticed that obviously wasn't quite right. "No offense," she opened, really unsure of how well Azilon would deal with being contradicted on matters of the self. Still, she really felt like she had to make sure nothing more sinister was afoot, especially since Azilon was their one real weapon against the nebulous force trying to break them apart from the inside. "But you don't sound all right. Are the constant controls of our data maybe becoming a bit much?" That time, it seemed like Azilon's attention had remained on her, meaning that Shida got her answer almost immediately, as the artificial quickly stated, "The controls? No, don't worry about those. I'm digitalized now, remember? Got all the processing power I could want. It's not that, it's..." The realized then cut herself off, apparently realizing that she had followed her train of thought a little too far and said a little too much. However, with a clear trace to follow now, Shida was not about to let up quite so easily. It's... She pried a little deeper, letting Azilon know that she had very well caught that blunder. Azilon seemed to contemplate for a moment, which meant quite a lot, considering the speed at which she thought. Shida briefly stopped in her steps, feeling like this was getting a bit too important for an on-the-move type of conversation. It's strange, Azilon finally relented, though she didn't finish the sentence in the way Shida had expected. There is something about the network at the moment, something that I wouldn't even know how to describe. Like I said, it's strange, like nothing I've ever sensed before. Shida quickly moved herself towards the wall and out of the way, as she pressed her phone a little closer against her head. Thankfully, her hearing was fine enough to hear the speakers, even if they weren't directly at her ear. And does the Admiral know about this? She quickly asked. As much as she wanted to be sympathetic towards Azilon, the possible safety concerns for everyone involved were of a higher priority at first. Though, to her relief, Azilon soon enough clarified. Yes, she is aware and on high alert. However, right now, it doesn't seem to be anything dangerous. It is just a weird feeling, something slightly different that I can't put my finger on. However, I am constantly running several checks and diagnostics to make sure it doesn't have any malignant effects, and so far, they are all returning clean. Shida breathed a little easier, and with that out of the way, she decided that, as she couldn't do much else right now, she would at least try to be a better friend. Okay, so you said that you wouldn't know how to describe it, but can you try? She suggested, her eyes following some of the crew members as they walked by her, giving her curious glances as they passed, but not bothering her otherwise. Azilon made a slightly displeased noise. It would be hard to describe concepts like these to organics at the best of times, she explained somewhat dismissively. However, Shida was not about to be shaken that easily. Try it, she replied directly, a bit more demanding now. Just try to put it in meat brain terms. See if anything translates, and if not, you'll at least humour me for a minute. Azilon didn't sigh, exactly, but Shida had a feeling that she wanted to. Despite that, the realized soon began to slowly, certainly more slowly than was necessary, and that likely on purpose, explain what she found so off about the network. It's a subtle change, but it seems to be everywhere. It's nothing that I can concretely put into words, and when I don't focus on it, I quickly stop noticing it. But it's still there, and it seems to fill this entire cyberspace, she described to the best of her ability. Does that tell you anything? Shida's ear twitched as she listened to those elaborations, and her tail swayed against the wall as she thought about it. She hummed, to bridge a bit of a silent gap during her pondering. The memory of one of the first things she noticed when she woke up earlier suddenly popped back into her mind. Like an off-smell? She therefore suggested. Azilon made a contemplating sound. Smell is a concept I have very little context for, she admitted. I can detect particles through sensors if I connect to them, but the makeup of the particles they detect rarely give me a positive or negative reaction on their own. Shida shrugged slightly, even if it was more for herself. Well, a smell can be a lot like you described. It's everywhere. You can't always describe it, and if it's subtle enough, you get used to it pretty quickly, she explained. Although she sort of realized that Azilon could likely have found as much of an explanation on the net. But what would be the equivalent of an off-smell in cyberspace? Azilon wondered. And, sadly, Shida had absolutely no idea either. I mean, cyberspace is a bit more concrete than the physical world. Like, you have all the numbers and stuff, right? Shouldn't you be able to read what's different? She suggested, though somehow she managed to make herself feel stupid just by saying it out loud. If it was that easy... Azilon began to scold her, but Shida was quicker. You wouldn't have asked, yeah. I noticed when I said it, she admitted. Her tail swaying picked up a little in irritation. Of course, it was stupid to try and take the smell thing as a one-to-one comparison. However, with the way meat brains worked, that was the sort of thing Shida's mind tried to do. Smells were tiny particles in the air, and organic noses were better or worse at detecting different smells. Whether you had a positive or negative reaction to a smell depended on where the smell generally came from, and whether that was something to seek out or avoid in nature. Evolutionary, those who could distinguish good from bad, through smell, had an advantage. And while a lot, and that meant a lot, about the process of realization was still an enormous mystery that basically no one knew anything about, there were a few very sparse points that they did supposedly understand. One of which was an insane amount of information needed to flow through a program to make it realize, and the other was that somewhere in there, the realizing program had to undergo a sort of super-speed cyber evolution sort of thing, to transform it from a program that can only exist in the systems it was specifically designed for, to something that can migrate and adapt to new systems at will on its own. Obvious, if you thought about it, but possibly important here? If realized underwent a form of evolution, then that would most likely filter for advantages and disadvantages, too, if it was at all comparable to organic evolution at least. And thus, if this strange smell, or whatever it was, made Azilon nervous for its presence alone. She said she couldn't find anything malignant about it, but the same was often true for smells. The smell itself was rarely going to cause any harm, and it wasn't always easy to track them to their source either. Or maybe she was just taking that parallel way too far, and the comparison had only served to distract her from the actual goings-on. But still... Is there any way you could try to clear it out? She wondered, deciding to give the idea one more go. Just briefly flush it away or something? With smells that can help to either get rid of them, or to more easily find out where they come from when they start to come back. Azilon was quiet for a moment. Shida could almost feel a snide answer coming and tense slightly as she prepared for it. However, ultimately, Azilon mumbled, "I guess I could try this." She said it as if something was supposed to follow that statement, though obviously, just listening through the phone, Shida had not the slightest idea what Azilon had decided to do. She just trusted the Realize would know far more about the inner workings of cyberspace than she did. "It's coming back," Azilon then suddenly said, about 5 seconds later, making Shida snap up. It was a bit sooner than she had expected, but that was probably her own mistake. Cyberspace acted far faster than the physical world, after all. "And do you know from where?" she asked, once she had gotten over her self-induced shock. Although she wasn't sure if that was how anything worked here, she still felt the hairs on her neck stand up in anticipation. "I think, maybe, if I could," Azilon said, likely giving Shida a play-by-play of action she couldn't possibly comprehend at the speed they were performed at. "Yeah, I can follow that pattern and then Oh, stars! Oh, stars!" Shida flinched as Azilon's murmurings morphed into a surprised and clearly appalled exclamation, before then quickly turning into something that could only be described as a garbled torturing of her phone's speakers that burrowed right into her ear canal. "Azilon!" Shida yelled over the sound, quickly garnering the attention of everyone traversing the corridor around her as she needed to hold the phone a bit away from her ear, closing her eye on the same side in pain. "Azilon, what's wrong?" She tried to sound firm, but inside she was freaking out. Was Azilon under attack? What the hell could Attacker realized? Hell, what could Attacker realized and actually get a reaction? "Azilon!" Shida shouted again, hoping that whatever was going on, the powerful being would persevere in the end. The garbled noise lasted for a few more breaths before it slowly died down. The tension in Shida's body caused by pain went with it, but was quickly replaced by a pit in her stomach, as she could do nothing but wait and hope. By now, the passing crew members had started to assemble around her. Those who had been close enough to piece together what happened were all clearly as shaken up as she was about it, and everyone who wasn't soon picked up on the general mood. Everyone stared at the phone as the corridor became very, very quiet. "Azilon?" Shida asked again, more quietly now, though she didn't need to yell over anything. "Are you there?" To her great relief, the speaker actually crackled to life that time. It's... Azilon began to say, but interrupted herself with a strange sound. A sound that didn't really fit with the kinds of noises I realized generally made. A sound that almost sounded like gagging. It's awful. She managed to press out a few moments later. And although that wasn't a real possibility, it almost sounded like she was getting close to tears. It is so awful.